Okay, we'll start with a small quiz. Please look at the statement that is on the screen, and all you have to do is raise your hand with a finger 1, a finger 2, or a finger 3 to indicate your choice so that I can see it. The statement is Vedas or eternal knowledge. Okay, one. Jyoti Ranjan, I do not know. Okay, Anita, 1. Nisha, 3. I do not know. Very good. Pramina, 1. Let me see the rest of the names. Prasanna, 1. Raghu, 1. Sheilaji, you have said 1 or 1? Okay. Kumaranji. Everybody says it is eternal knowledge. Pradeep, you are not on video, so I can't see your face to say what it is. Okay, we will take, looks like majority have said true, right? Very good. Now, the question is, can you bring up the next slide, please, Mahesh? There is a problem with your statement. Okay. Traditionally, can you go to the next slide, Mahesh? Thank you. See, how can Vedas be eternal knowledge when we notice that all knowledge that we are possessing is constantly growing, correct? And continuously evolving. See, for example, earlier, many years back, we believed the earth was flat. That was knowledge. Then later on, the realization that earth is curved, that became the knowledge. The Newton's theory that we are all familiar has been replaced by quantum physics. So when knowledge is continuously morphing and continuously changing and continuously evolving, how can we say that Vedas is an eternal knowledge? The answer lies in the specific construct of Sanskrit. It's a Sanskrit grammar related point that will make the meaning clear. Just as we say a book on physics is called physics book, in the same way, to know Veda in Sanskrit means to know about the eternal is called eternal knowledge. Earlier it was in Sanskrit. Now today we are going to talk about Vedas in English. It has changed. But the subject matter of Vedas is the eternal. I'm not qualifying it with eternity or anything like that. I'm just saying it is the knowledge of the eternal. That which is the absolute truth. The Vedas or eternal means only that the knowledge which is the theme of Vedas is eternal. The central purpose of Vedas, the central purport of Vedas is the subject matter called eternal. Therefore, we say it is the knowledge of the eternal. It is interesting to know that when we say Vedas, we are not referring to the textbook in Sanskrit. The word Veda comes from the root called Vid, means to know. Every Sanskrit term comes from a root, like Latin. So if you know the root, you will get to know what exactly the word means. So Veda comes from Ved by a certain morphology that takes place when you apply the rules of Sanskrit on that root. So Veda means to know. Know what? Know the eternal. Since the textbook is dealing with the knowledge as its subject matter, matter, the entire set of scriptural instructions have come to be named as Vedas. So, knowing the eternal is the right meaning for the term Veda. How did eternal come to be? Why not we say knowing the limited is called Vedas? Because there is an ambiguity in choosing whether Vedas is talking about the eternal or the limited, because there is a lack of clarity on whether Vedas is talking about only the eternal, or is it talking about only the limited, or is it talking about both. The term eternal is dropped. So we don't say Nitya Veda or Vedo Nityam. We don't say that. We simply say Vedas. So we'll have to go a little bit deeper into Vedas to find out what is exactly being pointed out in Vedas. For that, we must understand what is this eternity we are talking about. What is this eternal thing? Next slide, please. See, anything that we come to know in life, which is also the subject matter of Vedas, the means, comes under two categories. Okay. The first category is known as apara vidya. Apara means that which is not supreme. All our perceptual knowledge which we gain through our sense organs, or all that knowledge we can infer by applying our mind on whatever we perceive, or all that we can analyze and correlate and then come to some conclusion, together is called apara knowledge. Apara means the ability to perceive something, to infer something from that perception, or analyze and come to some conclusion based upon that perception. If I see all of you on the screen, I perceive you are there. But I infer from the screen that all of you are at different places. That is an inference. On analyzing, I come to know that some of you are using a particular software to connect into the system. All this is apara vidya. Anything that is based on perception, whether it be inferred or analyzed, is all coming under the class of apara vidya. But there is an inherent awareness in us about ourselves. When somebody says, "Are you Sheila? Are you Raghu? Are you Krishnan?" immediately we turn, right? Our eyes light up. How did you know that you are there who is responding to this call from outside? Even though there was a perception that a sound which mentioned your name was heard by you, but you associated that sound with yourself and not getting confused with anybody else on the screen. That is called inherent awareness. This inherent awareness of ourselves never ceases. It may morph. I may be a happy person in the morning, a dull person in the evening, an active person during the day, but still that I does not vanish. I know I am. So what is the use of knowing that I know I am? Everybody knows I am. What is so special about it? The knowledge that I know I am should be present in you constantly. It has become so trivial that we have forgotten it. And we give importance to the non-trivial aparavidya, which is gained by reading or applying an inference or logic. And it has got so many branches that we spend hours and years, and you can mention so much words to it. Every time in our life is spent only in gathering all these bits and pieces of information, assembling it, correlating it, presenting it, and then we transmit it to others. We believe that more we share this inferred or heard or other logic, we gain some stature in the world. WhatsApp is a true example of why we are all struggling with the world. We continuously take information from somebody, some source, analyze it, and then share it with others. And then everybody claps. That information was never ours. Okay. But we never say I am I in any communication. We always will qualify that I with an adjective to say I am happy person. My name is so and such a thing. I am an engineer. I am a professional, etc. That all-pervading truth of ourselves is a common denominator between every one of us. Whether it be Sheila from Netherlands or Raghu from USA, it does not matter. Both will use the word I pronoun to address themselves, correct? Is the I that Sheila uses, is it gender specific? No. She transcends the gender, transcends the location, transcends the qualification and says I. Similarly, Raghu also says the same thing, I. But what we do when we hear the I is we attach the context and convert that I into Raghu the I and Sheila the I each time we transact. So, for the truth that this I is a common denominator and there is only one I across all of us, the ignorance that is attached with the I has to be removed. What is the ignorance? The ignorance that we have with our I is the qualifications we add to it. I am a man, I am a woman, I am learned, I am from such and such place, I am a doctor, I am a professional, I am a Vedantin, I am a teacher, I am a student. All this is adjectives. If you remove all these adjectives and look at the I is only one. So, when we transact, we are superimposing different things on that one single I as though making it look many. So, what the Vedas contain is the Upanishadic portion where the means for removing this ignorance of that universal I is removed. Now, the Vedas also contain Aparavidya. But the purpose of Aparavidya there in Vedas is to focus and gain that eligibility which will take us to Paravidya. So, is there any Aparavidya that will not take us to Paravidya? Yes. That is why there are people who are ignorant and there are people who are knowledgeable in this world. Why is that happening? Why is some Aparavidya will take us to Paravidya and some Aparavidya does not? We'll have to do some more analysis there to find out why it is happening. Now, whether a person uses the Aparavidya in the Vedas, whether he moves to Paravidya and then gains this knowledge of this universal I and recognize himself as the substratum of everything in this world, will it happen? Whether it happens or not, the Vedas does not become greater or less because of that. The knowledge is knowledge. Whether you are able to abide in that knowledge or not is a choice that you make in life. And like I told you, if your focus is not Paravidya, then Aparavidya itself will grab you, like it has done for many of us. How can I move away from this clutches of Aparavidya and then move to Paravidya is the point that we have to address before even we take up study of Vedas, correct? Before we even take to study of Upanishads. And what kind of eligibility is required so that we take to Paravidya will be the question that will come to our mind, correct? Next slide. The Vedas contain two portions, the Vedanta and the Karma Kanda. The Vedanta is the one which will liberate us from our limitations, so it's called Moksha Pradhana. Karma Kanda will tell you what kind of life you have to lead so that you gain this Moksha Jnana, that is called Dharma Kanda. So we have Moksha and Dharma as two facets in the Vedas. Now this Karma Kanda and Vedanta together is presented in four categories inside the Vedas. What are the four categories? The mantra portion, the Brahmana portion, the Aranyaka portion, and the Upanishads. It is interesting to know that these four portions are also associated with the four stages of our life. Interesting. I don't say it is compulsion. Initially, mantra adhyayan becomes the focus in the formative stage of our life. That is why young children at very young age were sent to Veda Pathshalas so that they can do mantra adhyayan. At that time, they will not know the higher principles of metaphysics, etc., but they will by heart everything. The Brahmana portion qualifies the mantra portion. And Aranyaka portion typically are segments of Vedas which will make meaning to us only when we are not engaged actively in life. Meaning, when you are withdrawing yourself from the worldly pursuit, the Aranyaka portion becomes meaningful. And when you have focusing only on yourself and ignoring the entire world, which is sannyasa ashrama, the Upanishads becoming very, very effective. Does it mean that a brahmachari cannot study Upanishad? No, it does not mean that way. Does it mean that grahastha should only do Brahmana portion? No, it does not mean that way. Does it mean a vanaprastha, the people who are withdrawing from life, they are the only people who are to study Aranyaka and do the upasanas prescribed in that? No, that is not correct either. No section is debarred because what you physically are very different from what you are mentally. I may be leading a grahastha life, but mentally I may be a sannyasi. Then Upanishads will start resonating in me. I may be a student studying in some college or some place, but I find that the upasanas are appealing to me. That means your mind has gone into vanaprastha stage, even though physically you are engaged in some other activities. Likewise, Brahmana portions, which gives the means and do's and don'ts, will appeal to even a sannyasi. So there is no direct correlation between or a direct injunction saying that only this stage you have to study this. Now the whole Vedas is only one Veda, but compiled by Bhagavan Vedvyasa into 4 sections called Rig, Yajur, Sama and Atharva. Basically it's a compilation. Like, we bind the Vedas into manageable book sets, we call them Rig, Yajur, Sama and Atharva, that's all. But strictly it is not 4 Vedas, there is only one Vedas. So the compilation is in 4 categories, but it has not been sectionalized into 4 parts like mantra part, Brahmana part, Aranyaka part and Upanishad part. They actually run all over. Only the contents are classified as whether they are mantra, Brahmana, Aranyaka or Upanishad. So they will occur anywhere. Some of them will be in Rig Veda, some of them will be in Sama Veda, it does not matter. But ultimately, all of Vedas will address 2 things. What is dharma, how to follow that, and what is moksha and how to gain that. That is the scope of Vedas. The preparation part is in the dharma or karma kanda, and the liberation part is described in the Vedanta or Upanishadic or moksha part of Vedas. Clear? Okay. Next slide, please. The term Upanishad, some of you have already studied, so it will be a repeat, but bear with me because this will be a rejoinder for what we already know. Upa plus Ni plus Shad becomes Upanishad. Upa and Ni are prefixes for the Sad Dhatu. Sad is the root. And it takes 3 meanings. Visharana, Avasadana and Gati are the 3 meanings. In 3 senses this can be analyzed. This particular word Upanishad can be analyzed in 3 ways. First way is Visharana means to destroy or dissipate the ignorance. So Upanishad will dissipate our ignorance, which is the primary way by which that limited I becomes the infinite I. The limitations which are born out of our ignorance are destroyed by the Visharana aspect of Upanishad's definition. Avas Gati is to take, to lead, take us somewhere. So from this limited I notion that we are carrying in our mind today, which is qualified by many other body, mind and intellectual characteristics that we possess, that is why we call ourselves a specific gender, specific name, specific profession, etc. That comes frequently because of that limitedness that is going along with the I. So from that limited I, we are going to enhance ourselves to the larger I, which is Brahman, the infinite I. The larger I is our ego, okay? That is, ego comes because we are increasing the number of qualifications that we add to the I. that is not larger. It is only the qualification that becomes larger, then it becomes ego. When the I becomes larger and qualifications are all removed, then we become Brahma. Gati is to take us from that limited understanding of ourselves to the absolute understanding of ourselves. Somewhere we are going, therefore Gati, Brahman. Avasadhana means Shitali Karna. The word Shitali Karna is to loosen, to decay, to destroy, etc. To actually break it into pieces and make it insignificant. It is called Unmoolanam, remove from the roots itself, uprooting it. So, Avasadhana is to take something away at the root level so that it never comes back. Those who are doing gardening will know when you remove the weeds, after some days again the small thing comes up. So we have to remove it at the root, then only the weeds stop growing. The same way, this notion that my I, that I have, is qualified by my BMI is a thing that we keep repeating. Every time we go to sleep, we drop it, but every morning we pick it up. So that kind of a removal is not meant here by avasadhana. It is remove it totally and permanently. Every time somebody says, "Who are you?" if we start connecting with our spouse by name, my language, my country, my notion, all these are qualifiers. That means we are not identifying ourselves with ourselves. The only answer we can give is, please don't ask me this question because I and you are only that I. That is the only right answer, but if we use that frequently, everybody will start laughing because nothing else can be done with that I. So, Upanishad, the term means devotedly sitting near. The word upa and ni says with devotion we have to sit near. What the three terms are: something that will destroy my ignorance, that will take me to my higher nature, and that will destroy all the falsity around me. And that means one should learn this at the feet of our master. That is what is meant by the term Upanishad. The term Sat also, which says put an end to, also indicates the truth which actually destroys all false notions. So Upanishad is constantly sitting near the truth. The means to constantly sit near the true nature of ourself is Upanishad. Yeah? Next slide, please. I told you that there is a possibility that this Apara Vidya will grip us so that we never turn to Para Vidya. So, the Dharma and Moksha part of Upanishad helps us address how we manage our Purushartha. Purushartha means the exact meaning of Purushartha is our goal or aim in life. So there are four Purusharthas, all of us might be familiar, I will repeat it. One is Moksha, the highest, then Dharma next to it, then Artha, wealth, and then Kama, desires. So either we can live a desire prompted life, or a wealth or possession prompted life, or Dharma prompted life, or Moksha prompted life. This moksha prompted life does not come to us easily, it's challenging. But a desire prompted life is what every being is born with. It's an inherent nature. When we have a desire driven life, there is a possibility that we will deviate from dharma. So desire and dharma together have got a contra effect mostly. When desires increase more and more in us, there is a possibility that we will slip from the path of dharma. And if artha and desire, artha means wealth, possessions, etc., material possessions, and desires together drive our life, we will become dharmic and believe that egoistically adharmic life is the right life. This is the time when you are continuously going to be in apara vidya to see how to increase my wealth so that all my desires are fulfilled. This is exactly describing us before we started this journey into Veda. All of you would know I'm talking only common sense. All of us have gone through this. When we believe that wealth, house, possession made our life. By the grace of God, when this Vedanta creeps into us through bhakti or through other means, then dharma starts dictating our life. Then we find that artha and kama are subsumed in a dharmic approach to life. And that is when the mind and intellect that we possess becomes qualified to pursue moksha. We are all in that stage now. Various degrees. Some of us are closer to moksha, almost there. Some of us are still at the starting stage. That is why we use those terms. I find this difficult. I find this difficult. It is not difficult. Your mind is getting transformed continuously. Every word of Vedanta that you listen is transforming you, knowingly or unknowingly, because there are some parts of our mind that we do not know. The one thing that you have to hold on in Vedantic journey is absolute faith in Bhagavan, who is always with you in this journey, number one, and an absolute faith in yourself that nothing will go wrong in this path because my pursuit is the highest pursuit. In lower pursuit, there will be hurdles. If you want to fulfill your desire, somebody else has to cooperate. And if he does not, your desires will not be fulfilled. If you want to earn money, somebody has to give you that money. If you don't get that, your desires are not fulfilled. But in Moksha Marga, nothing is required from anybody except you. And therefore, just having faith in yourself and faith in Bhagavan is enough. Faith in Bhagavan so that Dharma will protect you against the world, and faith in yourself so that you remain steadfast in this path of liberation. The Nivritti Dharma, which is called Moksha Marga, contains 4 limbs: Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, and Samadhi. I think these terms must be familiar to all of you. I'm not going into the deep depths of it. Shravana means constantly and repeatedly listening and assimilating the knowledge of the Vedanta. Manana is to contemplate on it. Nididhyasana is to abide in that, meditate on that truth. Samadhi is to remain in that awareness. First, it is going to be with effort, and then finally it will become an effortless abidance in that state, and that is called moksha. The Shravana that we have to do has to be qualified by one adjective, which is called Shraddha Purvaka Shravana. Shraddha means faith. With faith, we must do Shravana. Without faith, you should not listen to Vedanta, because Vedanta will not have any effect on you. Not because it is debarred from your knowing, it won't have any effect. Therefore, faith is required prior to listening. Faith in the teacher, faith in the teaching. Both. This person comes from far off country. How will he know Vedanta? Many people have that, This is called ahankara only. And for manana, you need bhakti. Because when you actually do the contemplation, there will be a lot of conflicts from what artha and karma driven life pushes against us in our. So when our earlier life is predominantly materialistic, it will throw hurdles saying, if you do this Vedanta, if I lose my identity of my ego, then who will do all the homework and everything that is to be done? Who will support the family? All these questions will come. And there bhakti alone will allow you to steer yourself through proper contemplation. Otherwise, we will just go all over the place. For nididhyasana, your mental presence is important. Therefore, dhyana purvaka nididhyasana. Dhyana means fully focused. You should not say, I will do nididhyasana. Every 2 seconds, I will open the door to see if somebody is waiting for me, or some phone call is ringing, or somebody has forgot to switch off the fan, or the gas stove is burning. All this is interfering our nididhyasana. And in samadhi, initially it is effort driven, gradually it will become effortless. That is called pravritti and nivritti dharma in our scriptural parlance. Okay, next slide please. When we learn maths, physics and chemistry, what we require is a different approach compared to what we require when we are reading spiritual texts. See, language that we have today, it's only audible sounds where both of us have agreed this is the meaning of the word. So when I speak, I'm sending some sounds to you, which your mind interprets and comes to a conclusion that, yes, I understand what he is speaking. So this consensus between us that this is what is the meaning of the word is required. So we need language for that. Language is a set of rules which says this is the meaning, general meaning of the word, and this is the special meaning of the word. Both of us should know it. Then only we can build on communicating knowledge with those words. But these words can only convey lived experience. If I tell you that there is a tumbler which will not hold water, you will never understand what kind of a tumbler is that, because you never lived that experience, correct? We have lived a tumbler experience, but not holding water experience, we have not lived with it. So when I mix partially known and partially unknown, you will get confused. So at least one of us should know what that means so that other comes to know by my experience. So if something is there where I know but you do not know, and both of us have a common word which will link this experience, we can through that go. A bison is like a cow is a good example. Bison, some of them have not been seen. But when we say it's like a cow, we can imagine it's got 4 legs, etc., etc. So we come closer to the truth, but not absolutely. Unless we see the bison, we have not experienced it. So whenever we are talking about academic studies, it limits itself to only what is finite, which is known by everybody. But in spiritual learning, the rishis have employing the same language that we use, but they have given a link to the infinite. Somehow they have managed to communicate the infinite through the limited words itself. And only when the student is prepared to think along the lines the Upanishad is taking you, you will not grasp it. Otherwise, you will fall flat. There will always be 1,000 substitutions for Brahman, which is we call it a downgraded Brahman. And they are available plenty in the market today. You go to any speaker, they will tell you so much about it. But the absolute Brahman, which is absolutely one all pervading truth, it's very difficult to get it. Upanishad does this by using a suggestiveness to the terms that are used. That is why Upanishad is difficult for us to just read on our own and understand. And each Upanishad uses its own suggestive nature, so that when I read two Upanishads, I need to know what is the suggestion in this and what is the suggestion in that. Then only we will come to know. If you start comparing between these two, we'll get confused. Chandogya Upanishad says there are only three, in creation there are only three elements, whereas another Upanishad says there are five elements, which is true. Because we don't know the context, we will get confused only if we read too many Upanishads without correlating them. So, for revealing the subtle content of the Upanishad, we need a guide, and that guide is the Guru, who has understood, reached the absolute message that is conveyed through all Upanishads. Now he can come back to us and tell us how to understand each Upanishad, because he knows our plight and he knows the absolute truth. Without that Guru's intervention in our life, Upanishadic study is going to be difficult. It's not easy. Somebody has to trigger us to think in that direction, and that is a Guru. Next slide, please. What do we require to study Upanishad? Attentive listening, contemplation, single pointed meditation will take the mind of the meditator into that roaring silence, says Puja Gurudev, where one experiences that awakening of the truth. And it is, Upanishads are meant for contemplation. It is not to be read and relayed. That anybody can do, even a tape recorder can do that for you. It will do a better job than us. We should make it our knowledge. We should live that life of an Upanishadic seeker. Now, scholars can study nuances of the terms and take you to various depths of understanding and dazzle you, but that is not going to give you any authenticity of that Upanishad. Unless that particular scholar is also abiding in the truth, the purpose of Upanishad is lost. Study, along with constant listening and contemplation, and living a 4-point perfect life of removal from sense pleasures, clean experience and environment, maintaining clear thoughts, and constantly seeking the guidance from the divine is the life which will enable us to unravel the Upanishad. Next slide, please. That's all for today.